Shalom to everyone. In this second part of the presentation, I'm going to focus on the evolution of the Nusach of Catalonia. The Nusach of Catalonia, the process of formation of this Nusach began, or we can assume that it began, in the era of the Gaonim, with the arrival of the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon to Barcelona around the year 872, although no manuscripts have survived from this period. The Siddurim and Machzorim that have been preserved and have come down to us date from the 13th to the 16th century. No manuscripts have survived before the 13th century, and the only source of information we have from this period is, firstly, what we know, that the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon arrived in Barcelona, and secondly, some quotes made by Rabbi Menahem Hameri in his book Magen Abbot. Rabbi Menahem Hameri was a Provençal rabbi who wrote Magen Abbot as a book in defense of the minhagim, of the customs of Provence, and against, let's say, the minhagim of Catalonia, who were being introduced into Provence. And he states in the Magen Abbot that in Catalonia at first, a minhag, a nusach, and a custom were followed that were very similar to the custom of Sepharad, and that it was from the time of Rabbi Zerahia Halevi, in the 12th century, that this custom came closer to the minhag of Provence. This is also stated by Rabbi Aharon Gabai in his studies, and he says that the minhag or the Nusach of Catalonia was basically formed from these two, and that from the 13th century onwards it was already differentiated into its own minhag, as the sages state. Here you can see two of the quotes from Rabbi Menahem Hameri. He is talking about some Machzorim that came to him from Catalonia, according to him, from ancient times, and he says this, in Catalonia, which in ancient times was part of Sepharad, Machzorim from the land of Catalonia have come down to us that were written in ancient times, in times when that custom was not followed, since the tradition that was followed was the same as in Sepharad in most things. That is to say, here we see that he is telling us that in ancient times, the custom that was followed in Catalonia was almost entirely the same as in Sepharad. And in the days of Rabbi Zerahia Halevi, who left the city of Gerona in his youth, etc., etc., he continues and says, and so it was established in their Machzorim, that in their Machzorim it is followed according to what we follow in our Machzorim. That is to say, in the time of Rabbi Zerahia Halevi, the custom changed a little, and in the Machzorim, they came closer to the custom that was followed in Provence. And then he also adds in another quote, it says, when the great Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, the Ramban, arrived, he saw that before it was not customary like this. In this way this custom was annulled, etc., etc. He continues, he's talking about a custom of saying El Melech Naaman before the Kiryat Shema. He says, and so it is that in all the land of Catalonia it is customary according to Rabbi Ramban, and in all the land of France it is customary according to the sages of the Tosafot. Thus it is understood from the words of Rabbi Menahem Hameri that the Nusach of Catalonia was formed from these two traditions, the Sephardi and the Provençal. And we also know that the Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, changed the custom in Catalonia in some cases and returned it to what was the ancient Sephardi tradition, and his authority was accepted. This is on the one hand what the academic world says, and also what Rabbi Menahem Hameri says. But I always like to bring up and talk about two quotes from the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzhak Luria Ashkenazi, who is a 16th century Kabbalist. We could say that he is the most important Kabbalist, or one of the most important Kabbalists in the Jewish tradition, and his opinions, especially with regard to the Nusach of the Tefillah, were accepted by most traditions, and in almost all customs, the Siddurim were changed or modified according to the opinions of this great rabbi, Rabbi Yitzhak Luria Ashkenazi, the Arizal. And these two citations are very important, especially as regards Catalonia. The first one is brought by Rabbi Hai Haim Vital in his book Shar HaKavanot, when he speaks of the Nusach of the Tefillah and says thus, he says, there are many differences between the various Siddurim, between the custom of Sepharad, the custom of Catalonia, the custom of Ashkenaz, etc. Regarding this matter, my teacher, he is speaking of the Nusach of the Tefillah. Referring to the Arizal of blessed memory, he told me that there are 12 windows in heaven that correspond to the 12 tribes, and that the prayer of each tribe ascends through its own special door. This is the secret of the 12 gates mentioned at the end of the book of Ezekiel, called the secret of the 12 gates. This is the first quote, and the second one is from Rabbi Yeshaya Horowitz, known as Hashelah HaKadosh, in his book Shenei Luchot Habrit. And he says he's commenting on a verse from the book of Leviticus. The verse says, "The Israelites are to camp around their banner under the emblem of their lineage." And he comments and says thus, he says, "The Arizal used to say that there are 4 flags, just as there are 4 groups within the people of Israel who differ in their customs. And these are," he says, "Sepharad, Ashkenaz, Catalonia, and Italy. Each of these groups must remain around their flag following their own customs." And now he says, he ends. He says, "Elu velu divrei Elohim hayim." All of them are words of the living God. That is to say, each one of these customs, both one and the others, are words of the living God, and all are the truth. It is understood then, from the words of Arizal first of all, that the Nusach of Catalonia is one of the 12 rites that exist, and that they would correspond to the 12 tribes of Israel. And on the other hand, he affirms that the Minhag of Catalonia is one of the 4 families, or 4 main branches of Minhagim, of traditions, that exist among the people of Israel. So on the one hand, we see what academic research says and what Rabbi Menahem Hameiri says, and on the other hand, there are these affirmations, which also have great weight, from Arizal. Now I'm going to talk about the evolution of the Siddur after the expulsion. In the Iberian Peninsula, there were 3 Nusachim, or 3 traditions. One was the Nusach of Catalonia, another the Nusach of Aragon, and the third the Nusach of Castile. The Iberian Peninsula in the medieval period, in the time of the Rishonim, was one of the most important centers before the expulsion. And those expelled, both the Jews who left after the persecutions of 1391 and those who left with the expulsion of 1492, went to places like Italy, what would later become the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and they reached the Near East, to places like Syria, Baghdad, and even the land of Israel. These exiles took their customs, and also the Nusach of the Tefillah wherever they went, and in some places the local custom that existed before they arrived was the one that was imposed, and nothing remained of the Nusach, or the customs of the expelled, the Megorashim, as can be seen, for example, in Aleppo, where the Nusach Ramzova was imposed. But in the majority of communities, in the majority of places where these exiles arrived, the one that prevailed, or the one that was imposed, was the Nusach of these exiles, of these Megorashim who came as much from the Nusach of Catalonia as from Aragon or not from Castile. What also happened in some places is that the 2 customs were established separately. 2 different communities or different synagogues were created, some with the local custom and others that maintained the custom and the Nusach of the exiles. But what happened is that over time, over the centuries, these different customs merged into one, and normally the custom that was established was the Sephardi. The Sephardi Nusach was the predominant one and the one that in one way or another ended up imposing itself over the other customs. Of the 3 influential customs that I mentioned, let's say that the Nusach of Castile had very few piyutim, that of Catalonia had many piyutim, and then the Nusach of Aragon was a mixture of these 2. It had the Tefillat, very similar or almost identical to what was the Nusach of Castile, the Nusach Sephardi, and in the piyutim it was similar to the Nusach of Catalonia. Aside from these 3 branches, there were also many different subgroups, many customs. We could also come to the conclusion that in each synagogue, in each Bet Knesset, there was a different custom or Nusach, although these would obviously be the 3 main branches. And we see this in Turkey, for example, where there were up to 36 different communities, each with its own minhag and siddur, of which in the end nothing remained. Now I'm going to talk about the Catalan diaspora, and I'm going to focus first on what was Italy. These exiles who left Catalonia arrived in places like Sicily, Naples, Livorno, and Rome. We know that in Rome in 1517, the Catalan Jewish community was organized and built its own synagogue that followed the minhag of Catalonia, which was called the Catalan School. And later, at the end of 1527, this Catalan community united with the Kela of the Megorashim of Aragon. They decided to join together and form their own united synagogue of Catalonia and Aragon. This joint synagogue of Catalonia and Aragon changed location several times until 1904, when the synagogue finally joined with all the other synagogues in Rome, forming a single united synagogue of Rome that was established on the banks of the Tiber River. Since then, we have no news or information about the Catalan community as such. Another thing I wanted to say is that in Italy, neither Siddurim nor Machzorim of the Nusach of Catalonia were printed. Even so, I recently became aware I discovered, let's say, some Siddurim that had been kept or half hidden, we could say, in the community of Rome, that are not printed, but are late manuscripts from the 19th century, which until now, apparently no one has studied, no one has investigated, and I hope that soon they will be digitized as part of a digitization project between the National Library of Israel and the Jewish community of Rome. As regards what later became the Ottoman Empire, we know that these exiles were organized into communities, according to their place of origin, which were called Kehalim. These Catalan Kehalim came to settle in places like Istanbul, Edirne, Thessaloniki, and even in the land of Israel in the city of Safed, Tetfad. We know that there was a Catalan community. The most important or best known, however, was that of Thessaloniki, which had a very large Jewish community, and which over time was divided into two synagogues, two communities called Catalan Yashan, Old Catalan, and Catalan Hadash, New Catalan. It must be said that there was no difference between the two as regards Nusach or customs. They were simply divided by quarrels or internal differences. And this community, what must be said, is that it was very faithful to the ancient tradition and customs of Catalonia. It was very firm when it came to traditions. And already in 1527, they printed the first edition of the Machzor of Yamim Noraim, known as the Machzor Lenusa Barcelona Minhag Catalonia. This Machzor was reprinted in several editions in the 17th and 19th centuries, and in the National Library we have two of the 19th century editions, and also a late edition that was published as early as 1927. The 1863 edition was titled Machzor Lerosh Hashanah Veyom Hakipurim Keminhag Kahal Kadosh Catalan Yashan Vehadash. The 1869 edition is the one I mentioned at the beginning, from which we know how the Nusach of the Tefillot of the Sephardim came to be introduced into the Machzor. It was actually published in two volumes, one containing the prayers of the Aragon community and another containing the prayers of the Catalan Yashan and Hadash communities. Then we have the 1927 edition, published shortly before the Shoah, which includes 3 volumes. The first volume is called Tefillat Shemuel, the second Tefillat Yaakov, and the third Tefillat Saadi. Here you can see 2 photographs of the first edition from 1527 of the Machzor called Lenusa Barcelona Minhag Catalonia. It was the first printing of this Machzor. Later, as I said, the same Machzor was reissued. In these 2 photographs, you can see the 1863 and 1869 editions, and here you can see the 3 photographs from the first pages of the 1927 edition. In this edition, the 1927 edition, in the second volume of Tefillat Yaakov, there is a long historical introduction about the Catalan Jewish community, and it also describes the Machzor edition. It is a long introduction written in Judeo-Spanish or Ladino, and the same introduction is summarized in Hebrew in the volume Tefillat Shemuel. It is in Hebrew, as I said, and here you can see a translation I made into Spanish of some fragments of this Hebrew introduction, which is not to be missed. It is very interesting. He tells us thus, he says, "One of the most precious pearls that our ancestors brought from Catalonia when they had to go into exile was the ancient order of prayers for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, known as Nusach Barcelona, Minhag, Catalonia. And because of the misfortunes and the shock of exile that came fatally upon the poor wandering refugees, most of the customs became confused and little by little merged into the same order of prayers called Nusach Sepharad. Almost all, except for some exceptional communities that did not change their customs. The members of the Holy Community of Catalonia, of our city Thessaloniki, did not change their custom, and to this day they maintain the tradition of their ancestors and offer their prayers to God on solemn days, following the ancient Nusach that they brought from Catalonia. The Jews of Catalonia were the most distinguished among their brothers from the rest of the countries of Sepharad, and were superior in wisdom and science. The ancient communities of Barcelona always glorified that from their community came great rabbis and eminent men who illuminated the eyes of the entire Jewish diaspora. There was a saying that the Jews used to say, "The air of Barcelona makes you wise." Here we see, in addition to the praise of what the community was and the great wisdom of the members of the community of Catalonia, one thing worth highlighting is they describe how all the existing customs merged in the end into a single Nusach, which was the Nusach Sephardi, and the Catalan community stood firm and refused to abandon this ancient Catalan custom. Finally, I would like to say that the Catalan Jewish community of Thessaloniki was exterminated in the Holocaust. Most were taken to Auschwitz, and the few survivors arrived in Israel after the war between 1945 and 1947. As for North Africa, many Catalan Jews settled in Algeria, in the city of Algiers, which is today the capital of Algeria. We know that the community of Algiers was made up of Jews who came from Catalonia, mainly from Barcelona, and also from the kingdoms of Valencia and Mallorca. Two great rabbis, two great Rishonim, who are Rabbi Yitzhak bar Sheshet, known as Ribash, and Rabbi Shimon ben Semach Duran, known as Tashbetz, settled in Algeria, in Algiers, and became the highest rabbinical authorities in Algeria in North Africa of all times. Since then, the great rabbis of the Jews of Algeria were the Ribash, the Tashbetz, and also their son the Rashbash, Rabbi Shlomo ben Shimon, the son of the Tashbetz. Here we also see an answer from Rabbi Abraham ibn Tawa, who was the grandson of Tashbetz, of Rabbi Shimon ben Semach Duran, already in the 16th century. What he tells us in this answer is very important because we see that the way of ruling the halacha that they had in Algeria was based mainly on the Catalan Bet Midrash, on the Bet Midrash of the Ramban, and they did not follow the instructions of the Beit Yosef, but rather what they followed were the instructions and the rulings of these three rabbis, of the Ribash, the Tashbetz, and the Rashbash. And so, in this answer that appears in the book Tashbetz, in the book called Hut HaMeshulash, Rabbi Abraham ibn Tawa answers a question that the sages of Fez in Morocco asked him about the laws of Shabbat. And he gives us a very interesting answer. He says this, "Dear rabbis, may God keep you. You must know that we are descendants of those expelled from the land of Catalonia. And according to what our fathers of blessed memory customarily did in those lands, so too we are accustomed in these lands or in these places where we have dispersed because of our sins. You know that the rabbis of Catalonia, according to whose dictates all the customs of our community are based, are the Ramban, that is Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, the Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ben Edret, the Rea, that is Rabbi Aharon Halevi, and the Ran, Rabbi Nisim of Gerona of blessed memory, and other great rabbis who accompanied them in their generation, although their dictates were not published. Therefore, you should not question the customs of our community, since even if you do not find any matter explicitly mentioned in the books, it must be assumed that they followed the customs according to these great rabbis. Thus, we see how the custom of Algeria, of Algiers, was based on what was the minhag and the dictates of the Bet Midrash and the great rabbis of Catalonia. Also, with regard to the tefillot, the order of the tefillot, and also with regard to the piyutim, in Algeria they inherited what is the custom of Catalonia. We see here how Rabbi Yitzhak Morali, in a late 20th century edition of the Machzor of Yamin Noraim, of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur of the custom of Algiers, tells us that this Machzor was brought by our fathers from Sepharad when they fled the riots of 1391, and it was maintained by our rabbis, the Ribash, the Tashbetz, and the Rashbash of holy and blessed memory, and thus all subsequent generations have been accustomed to it. In a footnote, he also tells us that the custom of Algiers has its origin in the city of Barcelona. He tells us that we know that the Machzor arrived in Algiers from Barcelona around the year 1391. Another very important fact worth highlighting is that in the 18th century, what happened was that the ancient Catalan custom of reciting many piyutim and prayers and supplications in the middle of the tefillah was eliminated from most of the synagogues due to the influence of the Kabbalists, especially the Kabbalists who followed the Arizal. They said that the city's custom had to change. And what happened is that most of the synagogues in Algiers changed and adopted the Arizal custom, and the ancient custom was maintained in only 2 synagogues. Yes, in most of the synagogues, the custom was changed and followed that which was called the Kabbalists' custom, Minhag HaMekubalim, from which they took most of the piyutim. And the ancient custom, the custom that was called that of the literalists, Minhag HaPashtanim, was preserved only in the Great Synagogue, and in a synagogue that was called Yahin Uboaz, and that later changed its name to Hebrat Guggenheim. The ancient custom, that of the Pashtanim, which is the one that came from Catalonia, was also divided in two, one that was called Al-Malakain, and that had its origin in the city of Barcelona, and the other was called Al-Harian, and that had its origin in Majorca. This is described to us in the Tashbets in the second volume of its Teshubot. The citation can be verified in Siman 248. And these names, Al-Malakian and Al-Harian, refer to the neighborhoods where these two communities lived separately. Those from Barcelona lived in the Jewish neighborhood called Mala or Mela, and those from Majorca in a neighborhood called Al-Hara. And that's why the two customs were called that. The piyutim, these piyutim that were recited, which came from the ancient custom of Catalonia, were edited and published in a book called Krobats, and have been preserved to this day in Algerian tradition. This book, Krobats, has its origins in the custom of Catalonia. The word Krobats has several versions of where it comes from. Some say it's an acronym for Kol Rina Vishua Beohalet Tzadikim, which is a verse from the Psalms, and others say it's the fusion of the terms Krobot Tzibur. But be that as it may, this Krobats maintains the same piyutim that come from the tradition of Catalonia. And the chanters Hazanim of Algeria claim that the melodies they sing today to these communities that still maintain the ancient custom of the Pashtanim, they say are the same melodies that came from Catalonia at the end of the 14th century. And well, even though more than 600 years have passed, and there have surely been alterations, in any case, we can affirm that these melodies preserve what were the traditions of the liturgical chants and the melodies that were sung in Catalonia in the Middle Ages. Here you can see three photographs, one of the Krobats on the left. In the middle you have a photograph of the Machzor Katan, which is a Machzor of the Algiers tradition, and the one on the right is the modern edition of the 20th century, also of the Machzor of the Algiers tradition. And here we can, if you like, listen to some of these melodies that the Hazanim claim are the same and have not changed, just as they came from the tradition of Catalonia, and that were recorded in an ethnomusicology workshop that was held in Jerusalem in the year 2000. Here is a recording of some fragments. I would just like to give credit to the Hazan, Rabbi Shimon Darmon, who is a chanter originally from Algiers, who lives in Israel, and who is the one who recorded all these melodies. And I'd also like to say that you can listen to all of those melodies later if you want on my YouTube channel. If you search for Siddur Catalonia on YouTube, I have all of those recordings there, so we can go ahead and whoever wants to can listen to all of the recordings there. Now I want to talk about a fact that was very important, which is the appearance of the printing press. In the 16th century, the Hebrew printing press became very popular, and this caused many Nusachim to be unified. Many were lost, since in fact not all communities could afford an edition to print a Siddur of Tefillah. So what they did was that several communities joined together in a single Nusach, and they decided that that would be the Nusach that would be printed. In a printing process, one version has to be chosen from among many existing versions. So many were lost, many versions were lost, and others were standardized. Many traditions were preserved only in manuscripts and were never printed, as was the custom of Catalonia and that of Aragon. Actually, in the Minhag of Catalonia and that of Aragon, only the Machzorim of Yamim Noraim were printed, which included the piyutim, and in the Minhag of Castile, the complete Siddur was printed. This was because the Nusach of Castile had very few piyutim, and it was the Nusach that was chosen, let's say as the most appropriate one to print the complete Siddur. And this was the Nusach that was later extended in the printed Siddurim, and which is known today as the Nusach of the Sephardim. On the other hand, the Nusach of Catalonia was never printed. Another important fact was the influence of the Kabbalists of Safed, especially the Kabbalah of Arizal. The first Hebrew printing presses were in the Iberian Peninsula, in Portugal, in Ihar, etc. Then, in the 16th and 17th centuries, the most important centers of Hebrew printing were in Venice, Constantinople, and also in Thessaloniki. Then in the 17th century, this center moved to Amsterdam and also to Livorno. And in Amsterdam, for example, there are two types of Siddurim that are printed. Some large Siddurim, very large in size, and others very small. And these are prints that were carried out in printing houses that have the names of the printers. Portuguese names like Mendes, Rodrigues, Castro, Tartas, and so on. Then in Livorno, the customs of the Kabbalists spread, and there the Siddurim that were printed began to introduce many tefillot according to Kabbalah, such as Yehi Ratzon, Leshem Yekud, Kavanot, and tefillot in Aramaic that had not appeared before in the early printings in Venice. Many of the piyutim were also removed from the tefillah. At first they were transferred to what is later the barahot of the Kiryat Shema, and in the end they were removed altogether. And these piyutim gradually disappeared from the Siddurim. Some well-known Siddurim printed in Livorno are, for example, the Tefillat HaHodesh, the Moed Hashem, Zahor Levraham, Bet Oved, etc. These are some of the best-known Siddurim, and these were printed primarily for the communities of North Africa, since in North Africa, which was a Muslim country, it was forbidden to print books that were not in Arabic characters. And then the Jewish communities would commission the Siddurim from the printers, basically from these printers in Livorno. So in the 18th century, almost all of the North African communities adopted the Nusach from the Siddurim that were printed in Livorno. And this Nusach from the Siddurim of Livorno, as I said, adopted basically the Sephardic tradition of Castile. And that's how the Nusach of the Tefillot that came from Catalonia was also lost in North Africa. Many Nusachim disappeared, like that of Catalonia, and also the piyutim. Today, the Sephardic world, let's say, is divided into three major customs. We could say that the first is the Mizrahi world, the Near Eastern communities that basically adopted the strictest customs of the Kabbalists, and that's where they got all the piyutim. In North Africa, the custom of Castile was mainly adopted, and in some places the custom of Catalonia was adopted, but the latter was eventually lost. And then there is the branch called S&P, or Sephardi and Portuguese, which adopted the custom from Castile and Portugal. And these are basically the three great branches of the Sephardic world that remain alive to this day. As I said at the beginning, I will now refer more specifically to the structure of the piyutim in a separate section, and I will make a sort of chronological leap. Now I will go back again and talk a little about the origin, where this custom of introducing piyutim in the tefillah comes from. The first piyutim that we know of appear in the period of the Saboraim, which is the period after the writing of the final edition of the Talmud. And the Paitanim who are best known are the Paitanim of Israel. For example, Yossi ben Yossi from the 5th century, Yenai from the 6th century, and Elazar Beribi Kalir, known as Hakalir, from the 6th and 7th centuries. Many of these piyutim were actually composed as alternative nusach to the tefillot, or as additions to the tefillot. As I mentioned earlier, these piyutim were composed to be recited in the middle of the Amidah, the Hazara, or in the middle of the Barahot of the Kiryat Shema. These piyutim incorporated laws and agadot from the Talmud, especially the Talmud Yerushalmi, and from Midrashim, such as Bereshit Rabbah, Vayikra Rabbah, and other Jewish sources. However, this created controversy. Later, during the time of the Gaonim, there was great opposition to this custom of reciting piyutim in the middle of tefillah. The first one who opposed it was Rav Yehudai Gaon, who was Gaon in Surah. He opposed adding Agadah and Halaha topics in the middle of the tefillah. When he refers to Agadah and Halaha topics, what he is referring to is reciting piyutim in the middle of the tefillah. After him was Rav Sherira Gaon in Pumbedita. He was a very well-known Gaon, especially for an Egeret, a letter that he wrote known as Egeret Rav Sherira Gaon, in which he describes for us the entire chain of transmission of the oral Torah, all the sages, both from the time of the Tanim, the Amoraim, the Saboraim, and the Gaonim themselves. Rav Sherira Gaon says that it is forbidden to add a single letter to what the sages established in the Nusach of the Tefillah, which is called Matbea Shetabu HaHamim. And he says that this custom of introducing piyutim into the tefillah has no permission from the Talmud. Then in the 10th century, after the time of the Gaonim, in the 10th century they established new centers of Paitanim. The center of composition of piyutim moved from Israel to Sepharad, Catalonia and Provence, and also to Ashkenaz later. In the Minhag of Catalonia, as I said before, there were many piyutim within the tefillah that were recited on special Shabbatot and holidays. These piyutim, there are actually 3 types of piyutim structures, depending on where they are recited. The first are called yotzerot. They are piyutim that were recited in the middle of the berahot of the Kiryat Shema in the morning, in Birkat Yotzer, which begins with the words Yotzer or, which is why they are called Yotzerot. Then there were piyutim that were called krobot, because they were recited in the middle of the Hazara of the Amidah. And then there are the marbiot, which were piyutim that were recited in the middle of the blessings of Kiryat Shema in the Tefillah of Arbit. These piyutim were given different, more specific names depending on where they were recited in the tefillah, such as Zulat, Yotzer, Magen, Nishmat, etc. In my article that I published in Hebrew at the end, I include a list with each of these names and where each of these piyutim was recited. So if anyone is interested, please contact me. I can send you the article and you'll find this list there. But over time, these names, these piyutim, let's say, received the generic name krobot, krobah, krobot, which comes from the fact that Shaliat Tzibur, or Hazan, is close to Teba, to Hazan Karev Latava, and they were all named from the word karov. In fact, in the end, they all ended up being called by the generic name krobot. This name krobot later derived or degenerated into the word krobots, which, as I said before, has several interpretations or opinions as to the origin of this term. I tend to think more that it is the Catalanization, or the Francization, let's say, of the plural of the word kroba. Because just as we often make Hebrew words plural in Catalan, not in Spanish in Catalan, instead of saying mezuzot, we say mezuzas. Instead of saying megalot, we say megillas, since kroba would be the same as saying krobas, and the word krobas would be written with zadi at the end, which is very common, and would end up generating this word krobots. Another opinion says that it is an acronym for a verse in Psalms, Kol Rina Vishua Beohale Tzadikim, and then there is another opinion that says that it would be a fusion of the two terms, Krobot Tzibur. Be that as it may, what did happen is that during the time of the Rishonim, this controversy was renewed. This opposition to the custom of reciting piyutim in the middle of the tefillah. And great rabbis argued that this custom, these piyum, interrupted and created a pause in the tefillah. The first of all was Rabbi Yehuda al-Bar Galoni. In his book, Sefer Haitim, he strongly opposed this custom of saying piyutim in the middle of the tefillah, and tells us that this breaks what would be matbea shetabu hahamim, the coin minted by the sages. He also believes that surely this custom of reciting piyutim in the middle of the tefillah would come from some gezerot, from some sentences that the Gentiles established against the Jews. Surely in times of persecution, surely in the Roman or Byzantine era, and they prohibited the Jews from studying Torah, and that is why they included these piyutim, in which there are also laws and study of Torah, as a substitute for the study of the Torah, which would be prohibited. The second one who opposed this custom was the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. In one of his letters, he writes that he strongly opposes this custom, and says that these piyutim cause a disruption of the tefillah, and he says that if the kahal, the community, insists on saying these piyutim, they should say them either before the berahot of the Kiryat Shema or after the Amidah. Later, Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, known as Baal HaTurim, also opposed it for the same reason that these piyutim create a disruption in the tefillah. He says that this custom should be annulled. Another great rabbi was Rabbi David Abram in the 14th century, who said that this custom should be annulled. But arguably the most influential was Rabbi Joseph Caro in his work Shulchan Aruch, in which he determined the law saying that this custom of reciting piyutim in the tefillah must be annulled. Although it must be said that the Rama, who is the Ashkenazi posek who added notes to the rulings of the Shulchan Aruch and often refutes it according to the Ashkenaz custom, in this case he refutes it, and says that the ancient custom of reciting piyutim in the middle of tefillah should be continued. As I said before, the one who later opposed this custom of saying piyutim was also the Arizal. Thus we see that in the Sephardi custom, these piyutim were disappearing. In ancient Sephardic custom, in the manuscripts and in the first editions of Siddurim from Venice and Sepharad, there were still piyutim, especially in Yamim Noraim on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But from the late printings from Venice from 1584 to 1601, they took the piyutim out of the tefillah. They moved them to the beginning, before or after the tefillah, and later they gradually disappeared from these Siddurim, and most likely this was due to the influence of the Shulchan Aruch. Also, in the custom of Provence, these piyutim were disappearing, and this was first because of a takana that the sages of Provence established in 1596. This takana was intended to prevent people from saying these piyutim in the tefillah, and in all the Provençal communities, these piyutim were disappearing. We already see that in the late Siddur of the Provençal custom, a Siddur that was printed in the 18th century, which is called Seder HaTamid, and which includes the customs of the four communities of Provence, which are Carpentras, Avignon, the island of Sorgue, and Caballon. Well, these piyutim no longer appear. So most of these piyutim disappeared, both from the Sephardic custom and from the custom of Provence, and only some Sephardic communities in the Ottoman Empire, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia maintained some piyutim in Yamim Noraim. But in almost the entire Sephardic world, these piyutim, which were already few, let's say at the beginning in the Sephardic custom, ended up disappearing. Only in the custom of Catalonia and in the minhag of Ashkenaz, these piyutim survived. Here we can see 3 photographs of the Seder HaTamid, of the Provençal Siddur with the Provençal minhag, which was printed in the 18th century, and of which we have a copy in the National Library of Israel. As I said, only in the Catalan minhag and in the Ashkenazi minhag did these piyutim survive despite this great opposition from the rabbis against this custom of saying piyutim. And we see this in the Machzorim of Minhag Catalonia, which were printed in Thessaloniki, in which these piyutim were maintained, and also in the Machzorim that were preserved in North Africa, which are the Machzorim of Nusach Algiers, of Algiers tradition, and the Machzor Katan, in which the piyutim were also maintained in the tefillah. Although in the 18th century in most communities these piyutim also ended up disappearing. As a conclusion, I would like to say that when I got into this and began this research project, I realized that in the academic world there were very few researchers who had dedicated themselves to this subject of Nusach Catalonia. And I just wanted to mention 3 people who are Professor Bar Tikva of Bar Ilan University, Dr. Amos Dodi of blessed memory, who wrote some articles on the Machzorim of Catalonia and on some parts of the Nusa of Tefillah of Catalonia, and Rabbi Aharon Gabai, who continues to write quite a bit about the minhagim and traditions of Catalonia. Another thing I would like to say is that many scholars in the past have failed to identify the characteristics of the Catalan Nusach, and this is the reason why many manuscripts according to the Catalan custom have been catalogued as Sephardic or Provençal. In most of the academic literature, these piyutim that appear and are of Catalan tradition are almost always mentioned as being of the tradition of Algiers, Tunis, Thessaloniki, etc. But they almost never mention that they have their origin in the tradition of Catalonia. In my article that I published in Hebrew, I published a complete list with all the piyutim that appear in the manuscripts of Catalan tradition, which, as I said before, I hope will serve as a basis for the edition of the Machzorim, and I also hope that they will serve as a basis for future research on the Nusach of Catalonia and the influence it had on the customs of Algiers, as well as those of Italy and Thessaloniki. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation. I'm at your disposal if anyone has any questions or requests. I'd like to send you my article or more detailed information. You can send me an email, as you can see on the screen. Thank you very much. Shalom, shalom.